Salam, Taher.
Alaikum salam.
Sorry, I think that was a bit too loud. I can see my levels peaking a little bit.
Yeah, we're
Nice
going
to
to
see
be
you, man.
paranoid about this new platform and everything.
So, just a little background for our listeners and viewers. Me and Taher are longtime friends. So there might be some moments where we delve into some personal jokes, but we'll try to explain them. Taher, you've, mashallah, like, as we were just joking, you've done quite
Jumping
well.
straight in. No formalities,
Yeah,
no salams, no du'as.
So the salam came beforehand. So genuinely, you've done quite well, mashallah. I'd say in the poetry landscape, and the spoken word, and there's like a lot of things that you from time to time will message in our WhatsApp group. Features in magazines and scholarships and stuff like that. I guess for people that don't know who you are, I'm not saying that people don't know who you are, but for people that don't know who you are, tell us your journey into spoken word and poetry.
Oh, we have to go about a decade back, no longer. I was about 16 when I first started getting to know Hasib. He was a comedian back then, still is. As he was thinking, why did I bring a friend on this podcast? I started.
The knife cuts both ways.
No, it works both. Yeah, it works both ways. I'm interviewing you, and you can interview me. But yeah, no. On a serious note, I think the journey into poetry started when I was about 15, 16. Me and Hasib were on a forum of sorts, and I think that kind of encouraged us to, get into our creative elements. Hasib was into graphic design and artwork, and I was into literature and poetry, and we'd share all these little pieces. And for me, it was a couple of experimental poems, and we'd receive feedback, and that kind of encouraged me personally to kind of pursue poetry as a medium. I obviously took that into school with English teachers, and they weren't too fond of it. A lot of plagiarism remarks were thrown about, but I'm not going to get into
allegations.
Yeah, allegations. I don't know. Yeah, that school actually doesn't exist anymore. I think it was a school called Acton High. It was so bad that it doesn't exist anymore. It's been reformed, names changed. But yeah, I didn't receive that initial support, which I think is very important for a lot of people that are kind of trying their best to get into the creative writing sphere. Is that support from back home, from the school, is pivotal. And the only support group I had, support system I had, was a forum, which is the equivalent of social media now. So I had people that I didn't know, that I got to know later on, support me, told me my poetry was great, it touched them in a certain way. And that was all the support I needed at that initial stage to get me started. And from there on in, it was all about developing and honing those poetry skill sets. And I've done that through, again, sharing my work on social media. But for a large part of my poetry career, that was the end of it, just sharing work and people appreciating from the outset. But I decided a few years ago that I'm going to take it quite seriously, and I delved into academia, and I undertook a master's of creative writing and poetry. And that's when I realized that I wasn't as great as I thought I was in the world of poetry. Because, at the end of the day, poetry is an art form that can be constantly developed. And I was stuck in this tiny bubble of Islamic poetry, spiritual poetry, that was quite primitive in that sense. But then academia opened my eyes to a whole different world. And that's where my journey really kind of flourished, if you'd like to say that.
And it's been my honor to witness this from afar. Not afar, sorry, close up and afar, actually, because there's a lot of things that you do that you don't always, and this is something that I personally respect about you quite a bit. You don't necessarily always broadcast and shout from the mountains whilst you're doing it. Even someone like the kind of awards or like positions that you've been kind of granted and stuff. I don't see you broadcasting that on social media and kind of saying, "Hey guys, look at me! Like we're doing well." But what you have been able to do over the last few years is, I guess, amass this engaged social media following. I think over 20,000 followers now, right?
Yeah.
So mashallah to you, mashallah, brother.
MashaAllah, brother.
So tell me how it's been recently, like kind of dealing with that as well, because obviously you're very active on social media. I think you're kind of almost committed to like posting once a day or once every other day.
Yeah.
So tell me how you've been able to kind of facilitate that consistency. Like, what have you done to kind of make that consistency work for you?
We've discussed this before because you knew me quite well before the whole social media antic. I wasn't sharing
Before
any
you were
of my
famous.
stuff. Before the following, I just refused to outright share my work that regularly. You know, I would write every now and then. I undertook the whole publishing project of Lost and Found, and they decided, you know what, if people are actually interested in my work, they'll seek it out, right? And I was very wrong, because we live in a world where nobody will actively try to find a nobody that's Taher Adel, and that's where I was a bit confused. So when I did decide to put myself out there, because the content was always there, and I think that's a question that a lot of people end up asking is, how do you amass a following? At the end of the day, it's not about the following per se. It's more about the content. If you've got the right content and you know people will be will engage with that content, you slowly kind of put that out, and the following will, you know, naturally appear. And that's why I realized over the past year or so, I think I started this experiment at the beginning of COVID, or just before, when I told myself, you know what, I'm going to share a poem every 2 or 3 days and see what happens. I had no expectations. I had no hopes. It's just it's just for the sake of, you know, sharing my poetry to social media. And I decided to focus all that energy on Instagram, because I thought it was a perfect visual platform for my poems. And from there on in, it's just kept, the followers kept on amassing. The followers kept engaging with the content as well, and that allowed me to experiment as well with the type of poetry I was sharing. I realized some people will follow me for spiritual content, others for things about the Arabic language, and some people simply wanted to know more about poetry that is in conversation with identity, which I tend to delve into as well. So that separation in the type of followers as well became quite important for me, because now I realized I could attract a certain audience and therefore write to a certain audience. And now all my manuscripts cater to the audience that I've kind of developed over the past year or so. So yeah, understanding who your audience are and perhaps giving them what they want to see. A lot of artists, poets, don't like to pick and choose what their audience prefer. But at the end of the day, if you've amassed a certain type of audience, it's only wise that you continue to give them fruits that they enjoy eating.
No, that actually absolutely makes sense, especially when it comes to social media and stuff. One of the things I think has kind of distinguished you as a poet is your celebration of the Arabic language. So I think a few years back, and I think this is what kind of gave you that confidence boost as well to like keep at it, was you did 13 names of I can't remember what now. I don't know if you can remember specifically the first one that you did.
Or the first one, 14 Reasons Why. So
14 Reasons Why.
Words for Love.
Not to be mistaken for the Netflix special.
Was that around the same time, was it?
14 names of love, right?
Yeah.
And you basically look at how that's done, the different Arabic words. I'm going to just actually share my screen again, because I'm going to just try and see for our listeners, listeners, if you're listening, just go to Taher Adel's Instagram account, Words by Taher. So let me just bring this up real quick. So you've got one here, Arab flowers.
Yeah.
I mean, so this one's different. This one's not the Arabic words. Let me just scroll down and see if I can find them.
It'll be further down.
All right, let me just go to the one that I just saw. It was at the top. It was over here. Yeah, 12 names of fear, right?
It's a live experiment.
12. Yeah, it's fine.
Well, I'm loving it. It's different. You get to see the screen and all sorts. More engaging for your podcast guests.
Yeah, exactly. And it makes it more engaging for our conversation when we can actually reference the things that we're talking about. So you've got the 12 Arabic words for fear. And then what you're doing is taking that word and then writing a short poem for each one of those Arabic words.
Yeah.
That's such an inspired idea, man. It's so awesome to see that, because I think not only is it kind of highlighting the richness of the Arabic
language. Yeah.
You're also creating an emotional feeling to that word for someone who may not necessarily understand Arabic to that degree.
Yeah, and it's also a learning exercise for me as a writer as well. I think that's how it all came about. I ended up in a few workshops at university level, and a lot of what was favored by kind of the white English audience was to understand more about the Arabic language per se. And that's something I wasn't really interested in pursuing at the time. But then when I tried to explain a lot of the words, just, in conversation with them, and then I shared a few definitions, I realized each definition I was sharing was poetry in itself, because that's how deep the Arabic language was. And I was like, hey, here's an idea. Maybe instead of telling a person who doesn't understand the Arabic language that Arabic not only has 12, 13, 14 words for love, but explaining that word for love in a poetic manner and having that poetic conversation with it. And just by explaining the meaning and the roots of the word, each description definition became a poetic verse in itself. And I found that to be, incredibly powerful. And that's why, that was part of a pet project I undertook on Instagram to see how it works, to eventually work with it on a manuscript level. So a lot of what you see on Instagram is just a blueprint for what would happen on inside a book, which I'm working on at the moment. But yeah, the Arabic language, I think, is something that is very much understated. Like Urdu, like Farsi, they are very deeply poetic. And explaining that poetic nature in English brings about poetry in itself.
One of the things that you're currently working on is the 99 names of Allah.
Yeah.
So you're doing this series every so often where you're writing, what's one line called, a couplet?
One line, yeah.
For each one of Allah's names. Again, just like a very sick idea, man. It's because I guess what you're doing inadvertently and maybe deliberately as well is you're taking something that's deeply authentic to your beginnings in poetry, which is Islamic poetry.
Yeah.
And I can relate to that as well, because when I got into digital art and graphic design, it was Islamic digital art and Islamic graphic design.
Yeah.
But through that maturity, what you've done is, and obviously with your experiences with the wider world, like you said, through engaging with academia and non-Muslim and mainstream and even fringe poets and spoken word artists and musicians even, you're taking something that's deeply personal to you and producing in a way that's tangible and emotionally engaging to even non-Muslims.
Yeah, it's all about accessibility at the end of the day. I think, say, for instance, if we go back to the names, the Arabic names, there's a series of poems called the 12 Names of Sadness, I think. And that looks at sadness as a concept and all the names and words for sadness in the Arabic language. And what struck me is that wasn't something that wasn't a concept that appealed predominantly to Arabic speakers, but it stretched beyond that to the point where a funeral director contacted me, wanting to publish this segment, this poem series, into a booklet where they could use at funerals. And this is a Western funeral director who comes across as non-religious, non-Muslim. So, like you said, it's all about accessibilities. Even with the names of God, I try to make them as accessible as possible. And I've been surprised by how often they've been shared by non-Muslims because they've resonated with it. So yeah, it's all about accessibility. I think with poetry, a lot of what we tend to do, especially when we creative arts in general, especially when we get bogged down with it, is we create all this art, fantastic artwork and fantastic poetry, but it's not accessible beyond the Muslim sphere. And I think there's a danger in that, because at the end of the day, our talents can be a form of da'wah in itself. And if you could be generous enough with your art form to have like a form of sadaqah jariyah, where everything you do not only impacts a soul, but also acts as some form of da'wah, even if it's not now, it could be after your lifetime. But yeah, it's just being able to think beyond the box, try to become as accessible as possible with your art form. I've learned that the hard way, because I always thought there's a beauty to the mystery or specificity of a piece of work. And I've always said, the person reading this should actually take their time, go on Wikipedia, find out who these people are, what they reference, and who I'm referencing in particular. And it's correct in a way, because you don't want the reader to be lazy, but with the same token, you want it to kind of appeal to a wider audience, and for that interpretation to stretch beyond the paper and beyond the reference that you initiated. And I think that's the beauty of metaphors in particular, where you could string up a metaphor and suddenly decide that this metaphor doesn't necessarily need to mean this. It can mean so many different things to so many different people.
And there's that fine line, isn't it, though? Like, of dumbing it down, right?
Yeah.
So you remember that Lupe Fiasco track from back in the day, Dumb It Down, which was basically his kind of like challenge to record labels, saying that were asking him to like dumb his lyrics down so it's more accessible and so it's more relevant.
Yeah.
But there is that fine line, right? Because you can sometimes get too kind of stuck into your own thing and be stubborn about it. And it's almost now coming from a position of stubbornness and arrogance, and just kind of almost like this, like, and the worst thing is, as a creative, we've witnessed creatives that end up doing that, end up putting themselves in more frustrating situations, because now as an artist, they want their artwork to be received and perceived and so on and so forth. But because of their own stubbornness to move just a little bit, they don't get that engagement, because all artists want that engagement, and then they're frustrated, and then it becomes more like it becomes a bit chaotic.
It is. No, it's definitely a fine line, because you've got that actually there's multiple fine lines here, because you don't want to be too clever, and when you're too clever, you lose out on a large chunk of audience who want to be spoon-fed to a degree. And there's also the ego fine line, where you try to be too smart for your own good. Well, I think the best example that I used to use is the William Blake example. So he used a metaphor where that famous line where he says, to see the world in a grain of sand and heaven in a wild flower, hold infinity in the palm of your hand and eternity in an hour. So that's a couplet that completely confused the masses. What was he saying? What did he mean by that? And it just looked like, William Blake was trying to be a bit too smart. But when you actually deepen and actually think about it, it can mean a million things to a million different people. Like most people say, oh, you know what? Let me think of a grain of sand. What could it mean? Or let me think of it literally. And then you start to look at the science behind it. And then there's a grain of sand, I think, in Japan, because I've done a bit of research on this, which looks like a whole universe when it's under the microscope.
Wow.
Or if you look at this Saharan ant who actually lives amongst in the desert, and his world is a grain of sand because that's all he can see, and that's the perspective element. So this is what poetry and metaphors can be, and I think you can be smart, but there's also that danger of excluding a few
Excluding
people.
people.
Yeah,
Yeah. And obviously, I think it's contextual in that, you write differently according to different mediums of delivery, right? So,
yeah,
and different audiences, um, whilst you're talking about like the kind of hidden meanings, these kind of like you have in poetry, sometimes literal meanings, but there's also several sometimes metaphorical meanings in one sentence. It reminds me of course, the Quran, which is revealed in the format of poetry, high art poetry at a time, and yet the Quran promises to be accessible to everyone that reads
yeah,
it, right? In any
yeah,
language as well. Obviously, Arabic being the preferred language for the maximum depth and the maximum richness.
yeah.
But ultimately, it can be read and interpreted in several different
Metaphor.
ways. I mean, infinite ways, depending on
Yeah,
the context, who's reading it, when they're reading it, why they're reading it, so on and so forth. That's why I think poetry is just like an amazing, amazing art form, because it's words, right? And words can sometimes, the way we're taught words in school can sometimes be a very mundane and laborious procedure. It's about
yeah,
spelling it properly. It's about pronouncing it properly. Whereas language is so much more than that. There's so much more richness and love to it.
yeah.
Tell
I think.
me, so I've got a question from Justin Mashuf. So I did post that on Instagram, and we did actually get a few questions. So I want to kind of do a nice little professional segue, like as if I'm a experienced host.
No, I think
So
while you're looking for the question, the whole education system is an interesting one. Because I was speaking to a few poets, and I think the unanimous consensus is that nobody enjoyed doing English. I don't. I'm speaking for myself here and a few other
I
poems.
loved it. I loved
Yeah,
it.
you loved it.
I
As
loved
in,
it.
I enjoyed delving into the anthologies and interpreting poems, etc. But I didn't enjoy English because of the type of poets on display. You had this whole beyond the trademark British syllabus, half caste, and a few others. It was predominantly old white men, people we couldn't relate to, and I realized later on that poetry is about experience, and when you read a poem that you could resonate with in a certain way, that's what piques your interest in poetry. And there was one poem in particular, which is my touchstone poem, and I think I'd like to read it at one point in this on this podcast, because that spurred my interest in poetry and made me write poetry, because I had no interest in writing poetry, and we'll get into it later. But what was the question?
I almost feel like it's better for you to share that poem now. Let's go naturally.
Yeah. So this poem is called Tichborne's Elegy, and I think the background is quite important. So there's a chap called Chidiock Tichborne, and I mentioned this in every workshop, and it's probably one of my favorite poems. So this chap is called Chidiock Tichborne in the 15th century, so 1500s. And that was a period where Catholicism was outlawed, and any sort of association with a Catholic movement, and you'll find yourself in London dungeon, potentially beheaded. And that's what's happened to this chap, where he ended up being the cousin of a famous Catholic leader of the time, or activist. I'm paraphrasing here, but he ended up in the dungeon as a result of his association with his cousin. And now he's been sentenced to death. He's due to die tomorrow, and he's in the tower alone, and he's got a few hours before his execution, and he decides to pen this poem down. So there's multiple narrations as to how he penned this poem down. Some say it was his own fingers, the blood of his fingers on the wall. Some say it was pen on paper, but either way, it's a powerful poem. So now you can imagine the context behind it. So man is going to be executed next day. And being a poet himself, what does a poet do on the final day of his life? Is he pens this beautiful piece, And it goes like this: my prime of youth is but a frost of cares. My feast of joy is but a dish of pain. My crop of corn is but a field of tears, and all my good is but hope of gain. The day is past, and yet I saw no sun, and now I live, and now my life is done. My tale was heard, and yet it was not told. My fruit is fallen, and yet my leaves are green. My youth is spent, and yet I am not old. I saw the world, and yet I was not seen. My thread is cut, and yet it was not spun, and now I live, and now my life is done. I sought my death, and found it in my womb. I looked for life, and saw it was a shade. I trod the earth, and knew it was my tomb, and now I die, and now I was but made. The glass is full, and now the glass is run, and now I live, and now my life is done. So that's the poem itself. So if you take the context into question, it's a very, very powerful piece. And that was a poem that kind of encouraged me to write, because I realized...
How old were you when you first read that poem?
14, I think.
14.
Yeah, so, but yeah, no, I think it was 14, and I penned my first poem at 15. But that was the poem that I would call the touchstone poem, the one I'd always refer back to, the one I'd consistently read. And it's powerful because of the truth inside the poem, because a poet in his final day wouldn't embellish the truth. Yes, he'll use fancy words and use metaphors to get his point across, but there's a lot of truth in that poem. And even the metaphors used are quite powerful. So there's a line in that poem where he goes, I sought my death and found it in my womb. So he was sentenced to execution by disembowelment. So that's literally
Bit
death
intense.
and death was inside his womb in that sense. So that the selection of words was incredibly powerful, and I think that encouraged me to know to write, and not only write, but write based on truth and my truth and what I perceive as my truth. So yeah, no, Tichborne's Elegy by Chidiock Tichborne is definitely a poem everyone should read at least once in their life or listen to.
That actually answers one of our listeners' questions. Mariam Jiwani, he was asking, what's your constant source of inspiration? Of course, I'm sure there's a wider answer to that, but I hope that answers your question, Mariam Jiwani. The reason why I asked you how old you were when you read that poem, because it strikes me that as a 14-year-old growing up in West London, not from a privileged background by any measure, how does a young Bahraini kid in not the most reputable schools or areas or climates or situations end up engaging with a poem like that, and then how did you deal with that as part of your wider image, right? Because there was a time where if you told your friends openly that, hey man, I get down with poetry, you might have found yourself in a bit of trouble.
Yeah, no, I think the answer's a bit conflicted, as a mixed answer here, because obviously I wasn't interested in classical poetry per se, but I was interested in rapping. So I had a lot of friends. Shout out to Jamal Edwards, who's very successful now. He ended up recording all our up and coming rappers in the area, and then that
including Ed Sheeran, right? Like, he was involved with Ed Sheeran.
No, his latest collab is with Ed Sheeran. Yeah. So one Ed Sheeran was, as in Ed Sheeran's latest track, is also a collab that Jamal Edwards has sorted out. But yeah, no, Jamal Edwards started off as a kind of grassroots cameraman. He started recording on his phone.
Was it good? Link Up TV?
Yeah, no, it was SBTV.
SBT, that's
rival to
Sorry,
Link
Jamal.
Up TV at the time. But yeah, no, he got his camera out, and we all had those camera phones, and there was a lot of talent in the community, and the talent would manifest in rapping. So he used to call himself Einstein, and everybody, me included, we used to do our own stuff, right? So I had an interest in rapping, and obviously rapping being a taboo subject wasn't something I could pursue. So naturally, the creative urge lingered on in different ways, and it eventually did manifest in poetry. But yes, to answer that question, going back as to how a 14-year-old Bahraini kid navigated around the whole idea of seeing what that poem was and what it made him feel. It was just the raw, like I mentioned earlier, it was the raw truth behind that poem, and I only thought that truth can be manifested in the form of rapping. I wasn't aware that a youthful person, a 14-year-old, could write about their objective view of the world, and for it to be accepted. And that's when I realized later on that poetry can encompass anything really. And it's not bound by anything. And I think that's what I love about poetry the most, is that nobody could tell you your poetry is wrong. Because at the end of the day, your poetry is your truth. It took me a while to realize I can pen anything, whether it's something to do with Islam or spirituality or my day-to-day life or what I'd done as an outing with my friends, our experiences. Everything can become poetry, and I didn't realize that until later on.
Sick. Speaking of acting, I've got a question here from a mutual friend. I'm going to ask the question first, and then I'm going to see if you can guess who it was. How does it feel to be the second best poet from Acton?
Second best poet. So that has to be Senna, right?
That's Senna indeed.
I've fully accepted being the second best poet from Acton. Like I said, there was like a 2-mile radius in South Acton in particular where talent flourished. So I can name you about 6 or 7 people, and that are incredibly, incredibly talented, but within like a 1-mile, 2-mile radius, came from the same school and the school didn't care about us, but we all loved poetry. We all loved our creative art. Oh, there's Senna.
She might kill me for showing a video that's 10 years old.
I would if that was me.
But I think it captures everything, right? Look, it's in the council estate. Man, it's making Miss London.
It's a shame she hasn't, released a poem quite recently. She used to be very active, but life in Qatar has clearly been too exciting for poetry.
Son, if you hear this, we wish you well in Qatar. No, man, that's because obviously, like, for me, when I was growing up and getting into art wasn't really out there. Do you get what I mean? Yeah. It was kind of like, that was like understandable, right? And especially the form of art that I used to get down with was street art. Like, you remember, like my graffiti thing was big back in the day. And so that was like, I wasn't ever seen as like, oh, that weirdo that's doing drawings. I was seen as, oh, it's Hasib doing those sick pieces of graffiti and drawing cars and all that kind of stuff. So I was very intrigued by your experience of that growing up in the hood, because the reality is we grew up in the hood, different parts, so East London versus West London.
West London. That was the thing. It took, as in the first time I visited East London, I think I was 18 years old, probably a little younger. But you can imagine that's how separated you are when you grow up in a certain area. You're not going to venture outside of your postcode. You're going to stick to your postcode. Firstly, it's dangerous to go beyond your postcode. Yeah. And there was no reason for me to go East London. I was like, why do I need to go East London? I got my chicken shops here. Ironically, the experience is chicken shops and
oh my God. Okay. I'm going to jump into the next question, which was asked by our boy Sadiq Damani.
Yeah.
And guess what his question was?
Something about chicken.
How much of a role did fried chicken play in making him the poet he is today? Boom. Now we can actually have a conversation about fried chicken as well.
Now, I think there was a while where nobody knew me for my poetry. Everyone knew me for my fixation
fried
with
chicken antics.
Fried chicken, right? Yeah, chicken cottage in particular. And then that's when I got to know people like Hasib, and they're like, no, chicken cottage isn't the best chicken shop out there. There's actually God knows what's in Morley's in East London, or no, that's South London.
Morley's a South London thing. Chicken Cottage was like a central like northwest London thing, and then East London, mate, we had a
Oh,
whole rich diversity of. We had Sam's as well.
The thing is, what blew my mind about East London is, in terms of food, you're so much more advanced than West London.
Don't talk about East London and fried chicken, bro. I'm in California.
You
right
know,
now.
a whole different sphere. As in, we only realized when we done our chicken tours. There was a time where I thought you were looking at.
Why is there lemon? Why is there lemon on this fried chicken? That's not right.
As in, we done a chicken tour, right? A fried chicken tour early years, 2012, 2011. Sounds like ages now, but yeah, no, fried chicken played a massive part in my poetic journey. I think not because of how it inspired me per se, but of the people it put me in contact with, and they inspired me through their work because they were also chicken addicts.
Let me just bring up your actual spot.
Well, the Bush one.
Yeah, Shepherd's Bush one.
The Bush one's historic.
Is it this one? Is this one right?
No. Yeah, it might be. Zoom in.
Is that Boss Man over there?
Yeah, Boss Man, Chacha. Yeah, there it is.
Man, you know what? Like, fried chicken is a part of everyone's journey in London. Every British Muslim's experience, particularly, especially in London, is heavily like there's fried chicken plays a big role in our story, man.
You know what it is?
It's a documentary.
It's our generation. We didn't have a lot of options growing up. It was Sam's.
And then all of a sudden we had a lot of options.
Yeah, and that's what I said. The new gen, they probably don't even eat chicken, as in chicken cottages.
Gen Z lot are probably like, not even Nando's, bro. They're probably eating tacos or something.
Yeah, my meat and bones were built on like Sam's chicken, like pigeon food, pigeon meat.
Pigeon meat. I hear that.
2 for 2s.
Man, I'm starving right now, and I'm thinking because over here in California, you have to understand, you don't get fried chicken, bro. These guys, they're doing all this Nashville hot business, so you only get tenders. And fair enough, the tenders is okay, but I'm not a boneless chicken guy. Like, give me that leg piece, boss. Give me that thigh piece.
Better bone,
man. Anyways, it needs a trip back to London soon, specifically just for fried chicken. Taher, I got a question here from Mo Bilal. What inspires your strange hypothetical scenario questions? And can I just quickly explain to the listeners and viewers before you answer that question? So if you follow Taher on Instagram, what you see in the newsfeed, versus what you see in his Instagram stories can be quite different. So yes. Taher will post these very bizarre hypothetical questions like, would you rather you a bird or a wolf? And there'll be like a series of 10 of them. And then sometimes they get really, really deep and they get really, really kind of like controversial at times. And this isn't something he actually just does on Instagram, man. He does this in real life. We were walking from Najaf to Karbala on this semi-pilgrimage walk, and I was tired, and and every 5 seconds, Taher is just like, "Hey, Yassib, would you rather be a butterfly or a goat?" I'm like, just stop, and he just couldn't stop. So, anyways, that's the context. Follow Taher on Instagram, and you'll see what I mean. But what inspires that? Mo Bilal wants to know.
What inspires that is boredom. You've seen it firsthand when I'm on holiday, and it doesn't need to be a pilgrimage.
You don't even do it when you're bored, Taher.
Yeah.
You don't even do it when you're bored.
You know what it is?
Sometimes when you're busy.
You know what it is? I'm curious to see how people respond. And I've got this thing where people know this as well. I kind of spy on the answers. So I pick a few people out and I try to guess what they'd guess as what they put down as their answer. And then I kind of analyze humans. Like a social experiment, like a psychology experiment on my Instagram page. So it sounds very creepy, but it's very, psychopathic. But
yeah, maybe we should edit this part out. No one's going to answer your questions anymore.
Just select people. It's mainly friends. Like I look out for friends and I try to guess what they'd say. Well, I think hypotheticals are interesting. I think they're related to poetry as well because of the way the human mind patterns things.
Right, you're really trying here to make it connect, aren't you?
No, it
But
does.
it's okay.
It
It's okay.
does
We can
really.
accept it as just being a different part of it, man. You don't need to try and bridge this into
It
some like,
does
oh,
really
I'm
connect.
actually doing art,
There's a
living
part
art.
2 to this podcast where we'll delve into hypotheticals and how it connects with the world of poetry and metaphors and patterning and sequences. Hopefully, is that fair?
Taher,
But for
yeah, we
now,
can
we'll let.
definitely do that. I
Huh?
want to pick your brains about another thing that I know that I don't think even you've shared or too much with your Instagram followers. Your obsession, it's a healthy obsession with the history of civilizations and in particular Norse mythology.
That's the problem with doing a podcast with your friend. He's going to dig up every single trait you have. Yes, I am fixated with Norse mythology in particular, and because again the parallels between our lives, our religion, and what people consider pagan civilizations. I'm of the opinion it's not substantiated, but if we go far enough, then every civilization obviously had a prophet, a guide of sorts, and we know that through the Quran. And I've got a feeling that if you look at every single pagan civilization in particular, you'll find very, very striking similarities with our faith, and that is Islam. And I do this annoying thing of highlighting them. So I'd come with like, oh, Loki is Satan, and I'd drum Hasib's head with a monologue of why he could be Satan, and why Midgard could be Earth, and why Asgard could be the realms of the angels. And so, yes, I am fixated
Listen,
with.
man, I love it when you do that because I'm also into history, but I don't do what you do, which is actually like do the reading and the research. I just kind of listen and absorb from like videos and watching boring documentary. Or they're not boring documentaries, but some people may say they're boring documentaries. I think Vikings is what really did it for me.
No, but Vikings the thing that piqued our interest. It starts with a show, right? And you're like, wait, what's this show based on?
Yeah.
And then it gets a bit deep, and then you realize things like Marvel have taken ideas from Norse mythology, but why have they done that? And how deep is Norse mythology? And we always think, oh, these pagans are, statue and, idol worshippers. But in reality, a lot of their civilizations believed in one God. And it's the same thing with, if you look at Norse mythology, there is a unifying, omnipotent being that they believed in. And if anything, that is, kind of monotheistic in a way. And the way they look at their gods isn't gods per se. And I think, the historians and the theologians could delve into this deeper, but it's more angel-like, more jinn-like, as opposed to what we define as a god. So if anything, their faith and their mythology can closely relate to the story of Genesis and story of humanity as a whole and how it originated.
Well, that's the thing, right? Because we obviously know that Allah had sent a prophet to all people at all times. So obviously there's going to be traces of that one same religion that God has been trying to get humans to kind of, reach, right?
Yeah.
So obviously, go ahead.
No, it tells you more about your faith, as in, at the end of the day, we as humans, we love to kind of dig up, ancient fossils of dinosaurs to learn more about ourselves. But how often do we try to learn about all these old, what we consider pagan civilizations, to know more about our faith? As in, we tend to dissociate, but why not associate as well? And it sounds really bad because it's a Muslim podcast, but why not look at the similarities so you could learn more about your own faith and the origins of your own faith? There's always this element of fear that we have when it comes to looking outside the box because of what you might see. But what if the more we look, the more we're content, and our faith, increases tenfold because of what we've seen outside? Again, this is a conversation that scholars are better equipped to handle, but as a
But the thing
poet,
at the
I'd like.
same time, I disagree because they
Mm,
have to maintain a certain status quo, which I
yeah,
understand, right? So they can't really be going out there kind of from the member talking about other religious beliefs, right? So it's almost kind of like left to us, the layman, to have these like abstract conversations and stuff, right? Which obviously we've got to be mindful of to not kind of get, you know, things a bit crazy. Um, but at the same time, it's down to us to have these conversations, right? Even on a
yeah,
public platform like the Muslim Vibe, because this is what like generally people are thinking and talking about, right? And the kind of thing that you mentioned there about like we don't have these conversations sometimes out of fear. Um, well, fear is not a good enough reason to believe in your religion, right?
yeah.
The fear of being wrong or the fear of you know something like that. That shouldn't be the reason. So we should have that kind of ability to investigate and learn about other cultures and religions, especially the ancient religions, man. Because like you know, it's not like anyone's practicing it today, so you're hardly really going to convert into like some you know Celtic pagan all of a sudden. But like I'm sure some small circles exist. And probably some internet forum as well that I might have offended right now. But you know, it's just one of them things, right? Or just enrich your own knowledge. But we're too scared to have
Yeah.
these thoughts even.
Right. At the end of the day, history in itself is a learning, is an amazing learning tool, because it tells you more about yourself and more about the civilization that you're living in, the time you're living in as well. Because often history repeats itself. And like I said, at the end of the day, even as Muslims coming from a monotheistic faith, it didn't appear out of nowhere. There were civilizations before that, and before that, and before that. And a lot of the remnants of those civilizations exist. And for us as Muslims, the least we could do is explore that, find out what happened to those civilizations, what they believed in, maybe identify where they went wrong. If you want to be judgmental, or identify where they went right, maybe we'll learn something. At the end of the day, civilizations are wonderful things to explore, and I've used that historic element in a lot of my poetry as well. And it makes for exciting poetry.
What's next for I was gonna say what's next for Taher Adel, but that's really weird, isn't it? No, let's. What are you working on right now?
Immediately, a few days from now, there's a TED, not a talk, but a performance. So TEDx performance. I'm looking at. It's a kind of a portrayal of school poetry and life, but the theme is spill the tea, and that refers to your truth or what my truth is. And it starts with exploring how poetry enters the mind from a scientific aspect, and then we'll look at it metaphorically, and hopefully will be a decent enough performance, and it'll be on YouTube at some point as well. So that's the immediate thing. I've got a few, I think 3 or 4 manuscripts that are in the works. A few of them are little tiny pet projects, which I'm hoping to release separately, but some are larger, like the Arabic language one that looks at the names. It's called The Names. So it looks at the names of the moon, the names of love, the names of wind, lions, camels, everything you can imagine in the Arabic language is explored in this little manuscript. And then you've got one that looks at Islamic figures. So that is called, haven't chosen a title, but I think I will call it The Chosen Names. And that looks at important Islamic figures and prophets before then. And that is kind of a simultaneous project that I've been working on. Both can be seen on my Instagram. But I think for the sake of separate audiences, they will be separate projects. And then you've got Pilgrim, which is poetry in conversation with identity, and that will be published by a mainstream publisher, and that will target an audience that is interested in identity poetry. So that's completely different as well. So that's work that's in the pipeline. But beyond this, I don't know. I'm excited about exploring spoken word as a video project beyond the the start of 2022, hoping to release a big spoken word video.
That's sick, man. You're doing a lot of things, mashallah, and it's amazing to see that like you're keeping consistent with it as a friend. I'm really proud of you to see that you've just been on it for the last like 5 years. Just kind of keep pushing, and doing more and more things, mashallah. And I pray that God gives you the capacity to do more. Taher, what would your advice be to any young Muslim listening to this? Or not even necessarily young, but someone who may feel like they have poetic talent, but want to know what the next steps are and kind of like some advice for them.
I think the first thing is knowing where you are in your journey. We often get caught up with, I need to be a popular poet. I need to get my work out there, and I need at least 20,000 followers. And that tends to be because a lot of people have set the bar high, and people assume that is the only form of success. And if you don't, achieve anywhere near that, then you're not a success and you're a failure. But in reality, as we all have our own journeys. 10 years ago, I thought I was at the top of my game. And then I realized later on that I was actually an abject failure, and I didn't realize it at the time. But it took me 10 years to know what kind of poetry I wanted to specialize in. Often when you start off your poetic journey, you've got the talent, you can produce the words, the content, and you can mix it all about. And you've got a few people that are supporting you throughout, but you haven't actually tapped into what your speciality is and the type of poetry that you should be exploring. And that might take another decade. And if it does take another decade, then that's fine. Some poets only realize their speciality in their 50s, in their 40s. And I often mention this example of Percy, what was his name? Percy Shelley. Percy Shelley was the husband of Mary Shelley. Mary Shelley wrote the famous novel Frankenstein. But Percy Shelley wasn't known for his body of work until after his death, where Mary Shelley, his wife, published his work extensively. And that's when he was known as the greatest poet of our generation, so not even our generation, of the entire English literature generation. So beyond Shakespeare, so beyond everything you can imagine in the English literature world, Percy Shelley is often ranked by academics at the very top, but nobody knew who Percy Shelley was in his lifetime. And I think a lot of people need to realize some of the best work comes towards the end of your life, and sometimes you won't even receive the kind of success within this life, whether it's you wanted to share it on Instagram and nobody reposts it. It doesn't mean it's bad work. It just means nobody's noticed it yet. So my advice is find where you are in your journey, find your speciality, and even and erase what you think is success, because success at the end of the day is subjective. And if it's a great poem, it doesn't mean it will be loved and adored, whether it's after your death or in your lifetime. At the end of the day, I can't create a structure for where success lies for a poet, because each poet is different. But what I can tell them is find your speciality. Know that if you do believe in your talent, it will be appreciated at one point or another.
That's deep, man. That's deep. Taher, it's been an absolute pleasure speaking with you. And inshallah, we'll have you on the podcast again. I did want to pick your brains about metaverse and stuff, but we're going to do that. We can do that another time. Maybe I'll just give you a call on WhatsApp one day and we can have that chat.
Shall we conclude with a poem?
Oh, let's do it, man.
Yeah.
Let's go.
Yeah. So this poem is about prayer. And the reason I've chosen this is because somebody was discussing prayer on Twitter, and I was like, hey, and he was an atheist. And the concept of prayer is a very interesting concept because of the psychological element that it has and benefit that even atheists are kind of seeing the power of prayer from a psychological point of view. So this kind of taps into that. So prayer is not just the head in the dirt. Prayer is not just the conversations found inside and outside the cornered bricks of mosque and church. Prayer is the desperate clutch on the crucifix. Prayer is God's name left lingering on lips. Prayer is a mother whose child is sick as the shift in the breeze. For a sailor ravaged by wind, prayer is not just an earnest hope or wish. Prayer is beautiful chaos when the world is full of order, with definite precision, thread-like and linear, where each wound feels overrun and each knot feels like it cannot be undone. And each action can only have one sum. Prayer is the impossible done. Prayer is the wild card, the hidden ace, the perfect glitch in the matrix, perfectly placed. Prayer is the question closer to you than your jugular, answered before you begin to utter. Prayer is one whisper at a time, one broken heart's moment to cry. Prayer is our arc when our seas are harsh, the rope when our love drop us and break us apart. Prayer is the symphony of the believer, the dancing little blades of grass. Prayer is asking for light together, leaves waiting branch to branch. Prayer is poetry, and prayer is art. Prayer is every space filled that once kept us apart. So yeah, now we can
Mashallah,
conclude.
mashallah. I should do this thing here, the clicking thing. Just for our listeners, just so you know, that's what we do at spoken word events. That was sick, man. Prayer is poetry. Prayer is art. I love that. I might turn that into a graphic.
Needs to be a graphic.
That's sick, man. No, mashallah, bro. Honestly, keep up the good work.
Thank you.
We'll definitely be speaking to you again. Like I said, I want to have a conversation with you on other things, because beyond poetry, you're a fascinating human being, and I hope that we can kind of explore that side on this podcast.
Thank you for having me, Hasif. It's been an absolute honor.
Oh, and guys, we're using a new software that lets us to record our podcasts and stuff, and there's sound effects. So we're just going to trial out a sound effect right now as we say goodbye to Taher Adel.
The first podcast get a round of applause. Making history out here.
All right. I'm gonna wait for the listeners' feedback before I keep using those. I'm gonna roll this feature out slowly, but I'm excited about these buttons in front of me. And
you know what it sounds like? Those late night LBC bros.
All right, man. It's been a pleasure. Take care. Salam.
Take care. Assalam.